All right, let's read some more. All right. Oh, that was good. I had half a sandwich. I think I'm going to start eating those. It's $2. If I were to cut them in half, I need to cut my food down anyways. So, all right. Let me just clear my teeth just a little bit. Introduction. Um, so if this is Phenomenology of Spirit, right? Introduction. 73. It is a natural assumption that in philosophy, before we start to deal with its proper subject matter, viz., the actual cognition of what truly is, one must first of all come to an understanding about cognition, which is regarded either as the instrument to get holds of the absolute, or as the medium through which one discovers it. Sorry. A certain uneasiness seems justified, partly because there are different types of cognition. Oh, hold on. Which is regarded either as the instrument to get a hold of the absolute or as the medium through which one discovers it. A certain uneasiness seems justified, partly because there are different types of cognition, and one of them might be more appropriate than another for the attainment of this goal, so that we could make a bad choice of means, and partly because cognition is a faculty of a definite kind and scope, and thus, without a more precise definition of its nature and limits, we might grasp clouds of error instead of the heaven of truth. This feeling of uneasiness is surely bound to be transformed into the conviction that the whole project of securing for consciousness through cognition what exists in itself is absurd, and there is a boundary between cognition and the absolute that completely separates them. For if cognition is the instrument for getting hold of absolute being, it is obvious that the use of an instrument on a thing certainly does not let it be what it is for itself, but rather sets out to reshape and alter it. Yeah? If, on the other hand, cognition is not an instrument of our activity, but a more or less passive medium through which the light of truth reaches us, then again, we do not receive the truth as it is in itself, but only as it exists through and in this medium. Either way, we employ a means which immediately brings out the opposite of its own end. Or rather, what is really absurd is that we should make use of all a means at all. It would seem to be sure that this evil could be remedied through an acquaintance with the way in which the instrument works. For this would enable us to eliminate from the representation of the absolute, which we have gained through it, whatever is due to the instrument, and thus get the truth in its purity. But this improvement would in fact only bring us back to where we were before. If we remove from a reshaped thing what the instrument has done to it, then the thing, here the absolute, becomes for us exactly what it was before this accordingly superfluous effort. On the other hand, if the absolute is supposed if the absolute is supposed merely to be brought nearer to us through this instrument, without anything in it being altered, like a bird caught by a lime twig, it would surely laugh our little ruse to scorn, if it were not with us, in and for itself all along, and of its own volition. For a ruse is just what cognition would be in such a case, since it would, with its manifold exertions, be giving itself the air of doing something quite different from creating a merely immediate, and therefore effortless, relationship. Or, if by testing cognition we receive of as a medium, we get to know the law of its refraction, it is again useless to subtract this from the end result, for it is not the refraction of the ray, but the ray itself thereby truth reaches us. That is, cognition. And if this were removed, all that would be indicated would be a pure direction or a blank space. 74. Meanwhile, if the fear of falling into error sets up a mistrust of science, which is the absence of such scruples, gets on with the work itself, and actually cognizes something, it is hard to see why we should not turn around and mistrust this very mistrust. Should we not be concerned as to what this fear of error is, not just the error itself? Indeed, this fear takes something, a great deal in fact, for granted as truth, supporting its scruples and inferences on what is itself in need of prior scrutiny to see if it is true. To be specific, it takes for granted certain ideas about cognition as an instrument and as a medium, and assumes that there is a difference between ourselves and this cognition. Above all, it presupposes that the absolute stands on one side and cognition on the other, independent and separated from it, and yet it is something real, or in other words, it presupposes that cognition, which, since it excluded from the absolute, is surely outside of the truth as well, is nevertheless true, an assumption whereby what calls itself fear of error reveals itself rather as fear of the truth. 75. This conclusion stems from the fact that the absolute alone is true, or the truth alone is absolute. One may set this aside on the grounds that there is a type of cognition which, though it does not cognize the absolute as science aims to, is still true. And that cognition in general, though it be incapable of grasping the absolute, is still capable of grasping other kinds of truth. But we gradually come to see that this kind of talk, which goes back and forth, only leads to a hazy distinction between an absolute truth and some other kind of truth, and that words like absolute, cognition, etc. presuppose a meaning which has yet to be ascertained. 76. Instead of troubling ourselves with such useless ideas and locations about cognition as an instrument for getting hold of the absolute, or as a medium through which we view the truth, relationships which surely, in the end, are what all these ideas of a cognition cut off from the absolute, and an absolute separated from cognition amount to. Instead of putting up with excuses which create the incapacity of science by assuming relationships of this kind in order to be exempt from the hard work of science, while at the same time giving the impression of working seriously and zealously, instead of bothering to refute all these ideas, we could reject them out of hand as adventitious and arbitrary, and the words associated with them, like absolute, cognition, objective, and subjective, and countless others whose meaning is assumed to be generally familiar, could even be regarded as so much deception, for to give the impression that their meaning is generally well known, or that their notion is comprehended, looks more like an attempt to avoid the main problem, which is precisely to provide this notion. We could, with better justification, simply spare ourselves the trouble of paying any attention whatever to such ideas and locutions, for they are intended to ward off science itself, and constitute merely an empty appearance of knowing, which vanishes immediately as soon as science comes on the scene. But science, just because it comes on the scene, is itself an appearance. In coming on the scene, it is not yet science, in its developed and unfolded truth. In this connection, it makes no difference whether we think of science as the appearance, because it comes on the scene alongside another mode of knowledge, on whether we call that other untrue knowledge its manifestation. In any case, science must liberate itself from the semblance, and it can do so only by turning against it. For, when confronted with a knowledge that is without truth, science can neither merely reject it as an ordinary way of looking at things, while assuring us that its science is a quite different sort of cognition for which that ordinary knowledge is of no account whatever. Hold on one sec. Nor can it appeal to the vulgar view of the intimations it gives us of something better to come. By the former assurance, science would be declaring its power to lie simply in its being, but the untrue knowledge likewise appeals to the fact that it is, and assures us that for it, science is of no account. Sorry. One bare assurance is worth just as much as another. Still less can science appeal to whatever intimations of something better it may detect in the cognition that is without truth, so the signs which point in the direction of science. For one thing, it would only be appealing again to what merely is, and for another, it would only be appealing to itself, and the other, or in the mode in which it exists in the cognition that is without truth. In other words, it would be appealing to an inferior form of its being, to the way it appears, rather than to what it is in and for itself. It is for this reason that an exposition of how knowledge makes its appearance will here be undertaken. 77. Now, because it has only phenomenal knowledge for its object, this exposition seems not to be science, free and self-moving in its own peculiar shape. Yet, from this standpoint, it can be regarded as the path of the natural consciousness which presses forward to true knowledge, or as the way of the soul which journeys through the series of its own configurations as though they were the stations appointed for it by its own nature, so that it may purify itself for the life of the spirit and achieve finally, through a completed experience of itself, the awareness of what it really is in itself. Okay. 78. Natural consciousness will show itself to be only the notion of knowledge, or in other words, not to be real knowledge. But since it directly takes itself to be real knowledge, the path has a negative significance for it, and what is in fact the realization of the notion counts for it rather as the loss of its own self, for it does lose its truth on this path. The road can therefore be regarded as the pathway of doubt, or more precisely, the pathway of despair. For what happens on it is not what is ordinarily dang it ordinarily understood when the word doubt is used. Shilly-shallying about this or that presumed truth followed by a return to that truth again after the doubt has been appropriately dispelled, so that at the end of the process, the matter is taken to be what it was in the first place. On the contrary, this path is the conscious insight into the untruth of phenomenal knowledge, for which the supreme reality is what is in truth only the unrealized notion. Therefore, this thoroughgoing skepticism is also not the skepticism with which an earnest zeal for truth and science fancies it is prepared and equipped itself in their service. The resolve in science not to give oneself over to the thoughts of others upon mere authority, but to examine everything for oneself and follow only one's own conviction, or better still, to produce everything oneself and accept only one's own deed as what is true. The series of configurations which consciousness goes through along this road is, in reality, a detailed history of the education of consciousness itself to the standpoint of science. That zealous resolve represents this education simplistically as something directly over and done with in the making of the resolution, but the way of the soul is the actual fulfillment of the resolution, in contrast to the untruth of that view. Now, following one's own conviction is, of course, more than giving oneself over to authority, but changing an opinion accepted on authority into an opinion held out of personal conviction. It does not necessarily alter the content of the opinion or replace error with truth. The only difference between being caught up in a system of opinions and prejudices based on personal conviction and being caught up in one based on the authority of others lies in the added conceit that is innate in the former position. The skepticism that is directed against the whole range of phenomenal consciousness, on the other hand, renders the spirit for the first time competent to examine what truth is. For it brings about a state of despair about all so-called natural ideas, thoughts, and opinions, regardless of whether they are called one's own or someone else's. Ideas with which the consciousness that sets about the examination of truth straightway is filled and hampered, so that it is, in fact, incapable of carrying out what it wants to undertake. 79. The necessary progression and interconnection of the forms of the unreal unconsciousness will by itself bring to pass the completion of the series. To make this more intelligible, it may be remarked in a preliminary and general way that the exposition of the untrue consciousness in its truth is not a merely negative procedure. The natural consciousness itself normally takes this one-sided view of it, and a knowledge which makes this one-sidedness is its very essence is itself one of the patterns of incomplete consciousness, which occurs on the road itself and will manifest itself in due course. This is just the skepticism which only ever sees pure nothingness and its results and abstracts from the fact that this nothingness is specifically the nothingness of that from which it results. For it is only when it is taken as the result of that from which it emerges that it is, in fact, the true result. In that case, it is itself a determinate nothingness, one which has a content. The skepticism that ends up with a bare abstraction of nothingness or emptiness cannot get any further from there. But must wait to see whether something new comes along and what it is, or in order to throw it into the same empty abyss. But when, on the other hand, the result is conceived as it is in truth, namely, as a determinate negation, a new form has thereby immediately arisen, and in the negation, the transition is made through which the progress through the complete series of forms comes about of itself. 80. But the goal is as necessarily fixed for knowledge as the serial progression. It is the point where knowledge no longer needs to go beyond itself, where knowledge finds itself, where notion corresponds to object and object to notion. Hence, the progress towards this goal is also unhalting. In short of it, no satisfaction is to be found at any of the stations on the way. Whatever is confined within the limits of a natural life cannot by its own efforts go beyond its immediate existence, but it is driven beyond it by something else, and this uprooting entails its death. Consciousness, however, is explicitly the notion of itself. Hence, it is something that goes beyond limits, and since these limits are its own, it is something that goes beyond itself. With the positing of a single particular, the beyond is also established for consciousness, even if it is only alongside the limited objects, as in the case of spatial intuition. Thus, consciousness suffers this violence at its own hands. It spoils its own limited satisfaction. When consciousness feels this violence, its anxiety may well make it retreat from the truth and strive to hold on to what is in danger of losing. But it can find no peace. If it wishes to remain in a state of unthinking inertia, then thought troubles its thoughtlessness, and its own unrest disturbs its inertia. Or if it entrenches itself in sentimentality, which assures us that it finds everything to be good in its kind, then this assurance likewise suffers violence at the hands of reason. For precisely in so far as something is merely a kind, reason finds it is not to be good. Or again, its fear of the truth may lead consciousness to hide from itself and others behind the pretension that its burning zeal for truth makes it difficult or even impossible to find any other truth but the unique truth of vanity, that of being at any rate cleverer than any thoughts that one gets by oneself or from others. This conceit, which understands how to belittle every truth in order to turn back into itself and gloat over its own understanding, which knows how to dissolve every thought and always finds the same barren ego instead of any content. This is a satisfaction which we must leave to itself, for it flees from the universal and seeks only to be for itself. 81. In addition to these preliminary general remarks about the manner and the necessity of the progression, it may be useful to say something about the method of carrying out the inquiry. If this exposition is viewed as a way of relating science to phenomenal knowledge, and as an investigation and examination of the reality of cognition, it would seem that it cannot take place without some presupposition which can serve as its underlying criterion. For an examination consists in applying an accepted standard and in determining whether something is right or wrong on the basis of the resulting agreement or disagreement of the thing examined. Thus, the standard is such, and science likewise, if it were the criterion, is accepted as the essence or as the in itself. But here, where science has just begun to come on the scene, neither science nor anything else has yet justified itself as the essence or the in itself, and without something of the sort, it seems that no examination can take place. 82. This contradiction and its removal will become more definite if we call to mind the abstract determinations of truth and knowledge as they occur in consciousness. Consciousness simultaneously distinguishes itself from something, and at the same time relates itself to it. As it is said, this something exists for consciousness, and the determinate aspect of this relating, or of the being of something for a consciousness, is knowing. But we distinguish this being for another from being in itself. Whatever is related to knowledge or knowing is also distinguished from it. Oops. And posited as existing outside of this relationship. This being in itself is called truth. Just what might be involved in these determinations is of no further concern to us here. Since our object is phenomenal knowledge, its determinations, too, will first be taken directly as they present themselves. And they do present themselves very much as we have already apprehended them. 83. Now, if we inquire into the truth of knowledge, it seems that we are asking what knowledge is in itself. Yet, in this inquiry, knowledge is our object, something that exists for us. And the in itself that would supposedly result from it would rather be the being of knowledge for us. But we asserted to be its essence would not so much its truth but rather just our knowledge of it. The essence or criterion would lie within ourselves, and that which was to be compared with it, and about which a decision would be reached through this comparison, would not necessarily have to recognize the validity of such a standard. 84. But the dissociation, or this semblance of dissociation and presupposition, is overcome by the nature of the object we are investigating. Consciousness provides its own criterion from within itself, so that the investigation becomes a comparison of consciousness within itself, with itself. For the distinction made above above falls within it. In consciousness, one thing exists for another, i.e., consciousness regularly contains the determinateness of the moment of knowledge. At the same time, this other is to consciousness not merely for it, but is also outside of this relationship, where it exists in itself, the moment of truth. Thus, in what consciousness affirms from within itself as being in itself, or the true, we have the standard which consciousness itself sets up by which to measure what it knows. If we designate knowledge as the notion, but the essence of the true, or the true as what exists, or the object, then the examination exists or consists in seeing whether the notion corresponds to the object. But if we call the essence or in itself of the object a notion, and on the other hand understands by the object the notion itself as object, viz., as it exists for another, then the examination consists in seeing whether the object corresponds to its notion. It is evident, of course, that the two procedures are the same. But the essential point to bear in mind throughout the whole investigation is that these two moments, notion and object, being for another and being in itself, both fall within that knowledge which we are investigating. Consequently, we do not need to import criteria or to make use of our own bright ideas and thoughts during the course of the inquiry. It is precisely when we leave those aside that we succeed in contemplating the matter in hand, as it is in and for itself, but not only as 85. I'm going to go ahead and just start the cycle. 85. But not only is a contribution by us superfluous, since notion and object, the criterion and what is to be tested, are present in consciousness itself, but we are also spared the trouble of comparing the two and really testing them, so that since what consciousness examines is for its own self, all that is left for us to do is simply to look on. For consciousness is, on one hand, consciousness of the object, and on the other, consciousness of itself. Consciousness of what for it is the true, and consciousness of its knowledge of the truth. Since both are for the same consciousness, this consciousness is itself their comparison. It is for the same consciousness to know whether its knowledge of the object corresponds to the object or not. The object, it is true, seems only to be for consciousness in the way that consciousness knows it. It seems that consciousness cannot, as it were, get behind the object as it exists, or consciousness so as to examine what the object is in itself, and hence, too, cannot test its own knowledge by that standard. But the distinction between that in itself and knowledge is already present in the very fact that consciousness knows an object at all. Something is for it and itself, and knowledge for the being of the object, for consciousness is for it another moment. Upon this distinction, which is present as a fact, the examination rests. If the comparison shows that these two moments do not correspond to one another, it would seem that consciousness must alter its knowledge to make it conform to the object. But in fact, in the alteration of the knowledge, the object itself alters for it too. For the knowledge that was present was essentially a knowledge of the object. As the knowledge changes, so too does the object. For it essentially belongs to this object. Hence, it comes to pass for consciousness that what it previously took to be the in itself is not an in itself, or that it was only an in itself for consciousness. Since consciousness thus finds that its knowledge does not correspond to its object, the object itself does not stand the test. In other words, the criterion for testing is altered when that for which it was to have been the criterion fails to pass the test. And the testing is not only a test of what we know, but also a testing of the criterion of what knowing is. 86. Inasmuch as the new true object issues from it, this dialectical movement which consciousness exercises on itself and which affects both its knowledge and its object is precisely what is called experience, Erfahrung. In this connection, there is a moment in the process just mentioned which must be brought out more clearly, for through it a new light will be thrown on the exposition which it follows. Consciousness knows something. This object is the essence or the in itself, but it is also for consciousness the in itself. This is where the ambiguity of this truth enters. We see that consciousness now has two objects. This one is the first in itself. The second is the being for consciousness of this in itself. The latter appears at first sight to be merely the reflection of consciousness into itself, i.e., what consciousness has in mind is not an object, but only its knowledge of that first object, but was shown previously the first object in being known is altered for consciousness. It ceases to be the in itself and becomes something that is the in itself only for consciousness. And this is then the being for consciousness of this in itself. Or, in other words, this is the essence or the object of consciousness. This new object contains the nothingness of the first. It is what experience has made of it. 87. This exposition of the course of experience contains a moment in virtue in which it does not seem to agree with what is ordinarily understood by experience. This is the moment of transition from the first object and the knowledge of it to the other object, which experience is said to be about. Our account implied that our knowledge of the first object, or the being for consciousness of the first in itself, itself becomes the second object. It usually seems to be the case, on the contrary, that our experience of the untruth of our first notion comes by way of a second object, which we come up upon by chance and externally, so that our part in all this is simply the pure apprehension of what is in and for itself. From the present viewpoint, however, the new object shows itself to have come about through a reversal of consciousness itself. This way of looking at the matter is something contributed by us, by means of which the succession of experiences through which consciousness passes is raised into a scientific progression, but it is not known to the consciousness. That way we are observing, but as a matter of fact, we have here the same situation as the one discussed in regard to the relation between our exposition and skepticism, viz., that in every case, the result of an untrue mode of knowledge must not be allowed to run away into an empty nothing, but must necessarily be grasped as the nothing of that from which it results, a result which contains what was true in the preceding knowledge. It shows up here like this: since what first appeared as the object sinks for consciousness to the level of its way of knowing it, and since the in itself becomes a being for consciousness of the in itself, the latter is now the new object. Herewith, a new pattern of consciousness comes on the scene as well, for which the essence is something different from what it was at the preceding stage. It is this fact that guides the entire series of the patterns of consciousness in their necessary sequence. But it is just this necessity itself, or the origination of the new object, that presents itself to consciousness. Without its understanding how this happens, which proceeds for us, as it were, behind the back of consciousness, Thus, in the movement of consciousness, there occurs a moment of being in itself, or being for us, which is not present to the consciousness comprehended in the experience itself. The content, however, of what presents itself to us does exist for us. We comprehend only the formal aspects of that content, or its pure origination. For it, what thus arisen exists only as an object for us. It appears at the same time as movement and a processing of becoming. 88. Because of this necessity, the way to science is itself already science, and hence, in virtue of its content, is the science of the experience of consciousness. 89. The experience of itself, which consciousness goes through, can, in accordance with its notion, comprehend nothing less than the entire system of consciousness, or the entire realm of the truth of spirit. For this reason, the moments of this truth are exhibited in their own proper determinateness, viz., as being not abstract moments, but as they are for consciousness, or as consciousness itself stands forth in its relation to them. Thus, the moments of the whole are patterns of consciousness. In presenting forward to its true existence, consciousness will arrive at a point at which it gets rid of its semblance of being burdened with something alien, with what is only for it and some sort of other, at a point where appearance becomes identical with essence, so that its exposition will coincide at just this point with the authentic science of spirit. And finally, when consciousness itself grasps its own essence, it will signify the nature of absolute knowledge itself. Cool. A. Consciousness. 1. Sense certainty, or the this and meaning. In German, it's meinen. 90. The knowledge, or knowing, which is at the start or is immediately our object, cannot be anything else but immediate knowledge itself. A knowledge of the immediate, or of what simply is. Our approach to the object, God, I can't believe how, that's totally what I've been thinking. Oh, I hate that. But it's nice because all that extra time I put into it really makes me appreciate this. Our approach to the object must also be immediate or receptive. We must alter nothing in the object as it presents itself. In apprehending it, we must refrain from trying to comprehend it. Because when we try to comprehend it, that's when we invent language. Yay! 91. Because of its concrete content, sense certainty immediately appears as the richest kind of knowledge. Indeed, a knowledge of infinite wealth for which no bounds can be found, either when we reach out into space and time in which it is dispersed, or when we take a bit of this wealth and by division enter into it. Moreover, sense certainty appears to be the truest knowledge, for it has not yet omitted anything from the object. But has the object therefore, or before it, in its perfect entirety, but in the event, this very certainty proves itself to be the most abstract and poorest truth. All that it says about what it knows is just that it is, and its truth contains nothing but the sheer being of the thing. Thatcher. Consciousness, for its part, is in the certainty only as a pure I, or I am in it only as a pure. Pure this, and the object similarly only as a pure this. I, this particular I, am certain of this particular thing, not because I, qua consciousness, in knowing it, have developed myself or related in various ways to other things. Neither of these has anything to do with the truth of sense certainty. Here, neither I nor the thing has the significance of a complex process of mediation. The I does not have the significance of a manifold imagining or thinking, nor does the thing signify something that has a host of qualities. On the contrary, the thing is, and it is merely because it is. It is, this is the essential point for sense knowledge. And this pure being, or this simple immediacy, constitutes its truth. Similarly, certainty as a connection is an immediate pure connection. Consciousness is I, nothing more, a pure this. The singular consciousness knows a pure this, or the single item. 92. But when we look carefully at this pure being, which constitutes the essence of this certainty, and which this certainty pronounces to be its truth, we see that much more is involved. An actual sense certainty is not merely this pure immediacy, but an instance of it. Among the countless differences cropping up here, we find in every case that the crucial one is that in sense certainty, pure being at once splits up into what we have called the two theses, one this and I, and the other this as object. When we reflect on this difference, we find that neither one nor the other is only immediately present in sense certainty, but each is at the same time mediated. I have this certainty through something else, viz. The thing, and it, similarly, is in sense certainty through something else, viz. Through the I. 93. It is not just we who make this distinction between essence and instance, between immediacy and mediation. On the contrary, we find it within sense certainty itself, and it is to be taken up in the form in which it is present there, not as we have defined it. One of the terms is posited in sense certainty in the form of a simple immediate being, or as the essence of the object. The other, however, is posited as what is essential and mediated. Something which is in sense certainty is not in itself, but through the mediation of an other, the I, a knowing, which knows the object only because the object is, while the knowing may either be or not be. But the object is, it is what is true, or it is the essence, it is regardless of whether it is known or not, and it remains even if it is not known, whereas there is no knowledge of the object is not there. 94. The question must therefore be considered whether in sense certainty itself the object is in fact the kind of essence that sense certainty proclaims it to be, whether this notion of it as the essence corresponds to the way it is present in sense certainty. To this end, we have not to reflect on it and ponder what it might be in truth, but only to consider the way in which it is present in sense certainty. 95. It is then sense certainty itself that must be asked, what is the this? If we take the this in the twofold shape of its being, as now and as here, the dialectic it has in it will receive a form of as intelligible as the this itself is. To the question, what is now? Let us answer, e.g., now is night. In order to test the truth of this sense certainty, a simple experiment will suffice. You write down this truth. A truth cannot lose anything by being written down any more than it can lose anything through our preserving it. If now, this noon, we look again at the written truth, we shall have to say that it has become stale. 96. The now, that is night, is preserved, i.e., it is treated as what it professes to be, as something that is, but it proves itself to be, on the contrary, something that is not. The now does indeed preserve itself, but as something that is not night, equally, it preserves itself in face of the day, that it now is, as something that it also is not day. In other words, as a negative in general. This self-preserving now is therefore not immediate, but mediated. For it is determined as a permanent and self-preserving now through the fact that something else, viz. Day and night, is not. As so determined, it is still just as simply now as before, and in the simplicity is different to what happens in it. Just as little as night and day are its being, just as much also is it day and night. It is not in the least affected by this other being, a simple thing of this kind, which is through negation, which is neither this nor that, a not this, and is with equal indifference, this as well as that, such a thing we call a universal. So it is in fact the universal that is the true content of the sense certainty. 97. It is a universal, too, that we utter what the sensuous content is. What we say is this, i.e., the universal this, or it is, i.e., being in general. Of course, we do not envisage ouch, the universal this or being in general, but we utter the universal in other words, we do not strictly say, ouch, what in the sense certainty we mean to say. But language, as we see, is the more truthful in it. Oh, I keep doing that. Mm, ouch. Mm. Ah, it hurts. Okay. All right, let's really read 97. It is as universal, too, that we utter what the sensuous content is. What we say is this, i.e., the universal, this, or it is, i.e., being in general. Of course, we do not envisage universal, this, or being in general, but we utter the universal. In other words, we do not strictly say what in this sense certainty we mean to say, but language, as we see, is the more truthful in it. We ourselves directly refute what we mean to say, and since the universal is true content of sense certainty, and language express this true content alone, it is just not possible for us ever to say or express in words a sensuous being that we mean. The same will be the case with the other form of the this. Ouch. With here is, e.g., the tree. If I turn around, this truth has vanished and is converted into its opposite. No tree is here, but a house instead. Here itself does not vanish. On the contrary, it abides constant in the vanishing of the house, the tree, etc., and is indifferently and is indifferently house or tree. Again, therefore, the this shows itself to be a mediated simplicity or a universality. 99. Pure being remains, therefore, as the essence of this sense certainty, since sense certainty has demonstrated in its own self that the truth of its object is the universal. But this pure being is not an immediacy, but something to which negation and mediation are essential. Consequently, it is not what we mean by being, but is being defined as an abstraction or as the pure universal, and our meaning for which the true content of sense certainty is not the universal, and all that is left over in the face of this empty or indifferent now and here. 100. When we compare the relation in which knowing and the object first came on the scene with the relation in which they now stand in this result, we find that it is reversed. The object, which was supposed to be the essential element in sense certainty, is now the unessential element. For the universal, which the object has come to be, is no longer what the object was supposed to essentially to be for sense certainty. On the contrary, the certainty is now to be found in the opposite element, viz., in knowing, which previously was the unessential element. Its truth is in the object as my object, or in its being mine, meinen. It is because I know it. Sense certainty, then, though indeed expelled from the object, is not yet thereby overcome, but only driven back into the I. We have now to see what experience shows us about its reality in the I. 101. The force of its truth thus lies now in the I, in the immediacy of my seeing, hearing, and so on. The vanishing of the single now and here that we mean is prevented by the fact that I hold them fast. Now is day because I see it. Here is a tree for the same reason. But in this relationship, sense certainty experiences the same dialectic acting upon itself as in the previous one. This I, see the tree and assert that here is a tree, but another I sees the house and maintains that the here is not a tree, but a house instead. Both truths have the same authentication, viz., the immediacy of seeing and the certainty and assurance that both have about their knowing. But the one truth vanishes in the other. 102. What does not appear in all this is the I as universal, whose seeing is neither a seeing of the tree nor this house, but is a simple seeing which, though mediated by the negation of this house, etc., is all the same, simple and indifferent to whatever happens in it, to the house, the tree, etc. The I is merely universal, like now, here, or this, in general. I do indeed mean a single I, but I can no more say what I mean in the case of I than I can in the case of now and here. When I say this here, this now, or a single item, I am saying all theses, heres, nows, all single items. Similarly, when I say I, the singular I say in general all I's, everyone is what I say. Everyone is I. This singular I, when science is faced with the demands as if it were an acid test, it could not pass that it should deduce, construct, find a priori, or however it is put, something called this thing, or this one man. It is reasonable that the demand should say which this thing, or which this particular man is meant. But it is impossible to say this. 103. Sense certainty thus comes to know by experience that its essence is neither in the object nor in the I, and that its immediacy is neither an immediacy of the one nor the other. For in both, what I mean is rather something unessential, and the object and the I are universals in which that now and here and I, which I mean, do not have a continuing being or are not. Thus, we reach the stage where we have to posit the whole of sense certainty itself as its essence, and no longer only one of its moments, as happened in the two cases where first the object confronting the I, and then the I were supposed to be its reality. Thus it is only sense certainty as a whole which stands firm within itself as immediacy, and by doing so excludes from itself all the opposition which has hitherto obtained. 104. This pure immediacy, therefore, no longer has any concern with the otherness of the here, as a tree which passes over into a here, that is not a tree, or with the otherness of the now, as day which changes into a now, that is night, or with another I, which something else is object. Its truth preserves itself as a relation that remains self-identical and which makes no distinction of what is essential and what is unessential between the I and the object, a relation, therefore, into also no distinction whatever can penetrate. I, this I, assert then the here as a tree, and do not turn round so that the here would become for me not a tree. Also, I take no notice of the fact that another I sees the here as not a tree, or that I myself at another time take the here as not a tree, the now as not day. On the contrary, I am a pure active intuiting. I, for my part, stick to the fact that the now is day and that the here is a tree. Also, I do not compare here and now themselves with one another, but stick firmly to one immediate relation. The now is day. 105. Since then, this certainty will no longer come forth to us when we direct its attention to a now that is night, or to an I to whom it is night. We will approach it and let ourselves point to the now that is asserted. We must let ourselves point to it, for the truth of this immediate relation is the truth of this I, which confines itself to one now or one here. Were we to examine this truth afterwards, or stand at a distance from it, it would lose its significance entirely, for that would do away with the immediacy which is essential to it. We must therefore enter the same point of time or space, point them out to ourselves, i.e., make ourselves into the same singular I, which is the one who knows with certainty. Let us then see that immediate is how that immediate is constituted, that is pointed out to us. 106. The now is pointed to this now. Now, it has already ceased to be in the act of pointing to it. The now that is another now that the one pointed to, and we see that the now is just this, to be no more just when it is. The now, as truth, is pointed out to us, is now that has been, and this is its truth. It is not the truth of being. Yet this much is true, that it has been. What essentially has been, gewesen ist, is in fact not the essence that is, kein Wesen. It is not, and it was with being that we were concerned. 107. In this pointing out, then, we see merely a movement which takes the following course. 1. I point out the now, and it is asserted to be the truth. I point it out, however, as something that has been, or as something that has been superseded. I set aside the first truth. I now assert as the second truth that it has been, that it is superseded. But what has been is not. I set aside the second truth, its having been, its supersession, and thereby negate the negation of the now, and thus return to the first assertion, that the now is. The now in pointing out the now, and thus so constituted that neither the one nor the other is something immediate and simple, but a movement which contains various moments, a this is posited. But it is rather an other that is posited, or the this is superseded, and this otherness, or the setting aside of the first, and is itself in turn set aside, and so has returned into the first. However, this first, thus reflected into itself, is not exactly the same as it was to begin with, viz., something immediate. On the contrary, it is something that is reflected into itself, or a simple entity which in its otherness remains what it is, a noun which is an absolute plurality of nouns, and this is the true and the genuine noun, the now as a simple day which contains within it many nouns, hours. A now of this sort, an hour, similarly is many minutes, and this now is likewise many nouns, and so on. The pointing out of the now is thus itself the movement which expresses what the now is in truth. viz., a result or a plurality of nows all taken together, and the pointing out is the experience of learning that now is a universal. 108. The here pointed out, to which I hold fast, is similarly a this here, which, in fact, is not this here, but a before and behind, and above and below, a right and a left. The above is itself similarly this manifold otherness of above, below, etc. The here, which was supposed to have been pointed out, vanishes in other heres, but these likewise vanish. What is pointed out, held fast, and abides is a negative this, which is negative only when the heres are taken as they should be, but in being so taken, they supersede themselves. What abides is a simple complex of many heres. The here that is meant would be the point, but it is not. On the contrary, when it is pointed out as something that is, the pointing out shows itself to be not an immediate knowing of the point, but a movement from the here that is meant through many heres into the universal. Here is a simple plurality of heres, just as the day is a simple plurality of nouns. 109. It is clear that the dialectic of sense certainty is nothing else but the simple history of its movement or of its experience, and sense certainty itself is nothing else but just this history. That is why the natural consciousness, too, is always reaching this result, learning from experience what is true in it, but equally, it is always forgetting it and starting the movement all over again. It is therefore astonishing when, in face of this experience, it is asserted as universal experience and put forward, too, as a philosophical proposition, even as the outcome of skepticism, that the reality or being of external things, taken as theses or sense objects, is absolute truth for consciousness. To make such an assertion is not to know what one is saying, to be unaware that one is saying the opposite of what one wants to say. The truth for consciousness is of a this, of sense is supposed to be a universal experience, but the very opposite is universal experience. Every consciousness itself supersedes such a truth, as e.g., here is not a tree, or now is noon, and proclaims the opposite. Here is not a tree, but a house. Similarly, it immediately again supersedes the assertion which set aside the first so far as it also just such an assertion of a sensuous this. And what consciousness will learn from experience and all sense certainty is, in truth, only what we have seen, viz., the this as a universal, the experience opposite of what that assertion affirmed to be universal experience. With this appeal to universal experience, we may be permitted to anticipate how the case stands in the practical sphere. In this respect, we can tell those who assert the truth and certainty of the reality of sense objects that they should go back to the most elementary school of wisdom, viz., the ancient Eleusinian mysteries of Ceres and Bacchus, and that they still have to learn, and they have still to learn the secret meaning of the eating of bread and the drinking of wine. For he who is initiated into these mysteries not only comes to doubt the being of sensuous things, but to despair of it. In part, he brings about the nothingness of such things in himself in his dealings with them. And in part, he sees them reduce themselves to nothingness. Even the animals are not shut out from this wisdom, but, on the contrary, show themselves to be most profoundly initiated into it. For they do not just stand idly in front of the sensuous things as if these possessed intrinsic being, but, despairing of their reality and completely assured of their nothingness, they fall to without ceremony and eat them up. And all nature, like the animals, celebrates these mysteries which teach the truth about the sensuous things. 110. But just as our previous remarks would suggest, those who put forward such an assertion also themselves say the direct opposite of what they mean, a phenomenon which is perhaps best calculated to induce them to reflect on the nature of sense certainty. They speak of the existence of external objects which can be more precisely defined as absolutely singular, wholly personal, individual things, each of them absolutely unlike anything else. This existence, they say, has absolute certainty and truth. They mean this bit of paper on which I am writing, or rather have written this, but what they mean is not what they say. If they actually wanted to say this bit of paper, which they mean, if they wanted to say it, then it is impossible, because the sensuous this that is meant cannot be reached by language, which belongs to consciousness, i.e., to that which is inherently universal. In the actual attempt to say it, it would therefore crumble away. Those who started to describe it would not be able to complete the description, but would be compelled to leave it to others, who would themselves finally have to admit to speaking about something which is not. They certainly mean this, then, this bit of paper here, which is quite different from the bit mentioned above, but they say actual things, external or sensuous objects, absolutely singular entities, and vason, and so on, i.e., they say of them only what is universal. Consequently, what is called the unutterable is nothing else than the untrue, the irrational, what is merely meant, but it is not actually expressed. If nothing more is said of something than that it is an actual thing, an external object, its description is only the most abstract of generalities, and in fact expresses its sameness with everything rather than its distinctiveness. When I say a single thing, I am really saying what it is from a wholly universal point of view. For everything is a single thing, and likewise, this thing is anything you like. If we describe it more exactly as this bit of paper, then each and every bit of paper is this bit of paper. And I have only uttered the universal all the time. But if I want to help out language, which has the divine nature of directly reversing the meaning of what it is said, of making it into something else, and thus not letting what is meant get into words at all, by pointing out this bit of paper, experience teaches me what the truth of sense certainty is in fact is. I point it out as a here, which is a here of other heres, or is in its own self a simple togetherness of many heres, i.e., it is a universal. I take it up, then, as it is in truth, and instead of knowing something immediate, I take the truth of it or receive it. All right, that's the end of one. Stop.